Tracy McGrady was once etched into the NBA as the embodiment of pure talent, one of the most complete offensive forces the league has ever seen. He was a seven-time All-Star, a two-time NBA scoring champion, and consistently earned all NBA honors as a true superstar in the most fiercely competitive era of American basketball. At his peak, Tracy McGrady was a nightmare for every defense, scoring from anywhere, exploding in moments no one could even process what just happened. He led Orlando through seasons averaging over 30 points per game, turning weak rosters into formidable threats simply by his presence. The moment of 13 points in 33 seconds in Houston didn't just become legendary. It's still regarded as one of the most absurd individual performances in NBA history, the kind that made the whole world believe Tracy McGrady could bend time itself. He earned the respect of his peers, the admiration of fans, and ultimately, the ultimate recognition when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, the place reserved for those who left an indelible mark on the history of American basketball. On paper, it was a career millions dreamed of, a full, brilliant resume that seemed to lack nothing. But it's exactly where the accolades end that the real story of Tracy McGrady begins, because running parallel to that spotlight was another life that no championship trophy or standing ovation could ever reach. Behind the image of the effortless genius was a man who lived with constant, year after year physical pain. Back pain so severe he couldn't stand straight once the locker room door closed, nights spent lying still in the dark, just waiting for the throbbing to ease before dawn. He learned to step onto the court with a calm face while his body was screaming for help, learned to stay silent when called out for lacking fire, because if he told the truth, he knew he could be replaced. One life was the symbol of genius. The other was a string of days forcing himself to stay upright, convincing himself that just a little more endurance would do. Tracy McGrady didn't live two lives by choice. He was forced to, in order to survive. And it was that very will, the refusal to surrender to pain, the refusal to beg for pity from the world that kept him standing on exhausted, broken legs for 30 years, until people slowly realized that some don't fail. They just quietly bear the full cost of genius without ever getting to rest. If you want to keep exploring the untold hidden corners behind Tracy McGrady's life and understand why that genius had to pay such a heavy price, please hit subscribe to the channel and drop a like to join us on this journey. Tracy McGrady didn't grow up in a childhood full of dramatic upheavals or shocks that people recount through tears, but in a quieter, more insidious kind of pain, prolonged deprivation, and the feeling of never being noticed enough to even become a named hurt. Tracy's childhood passed through ever-changing homes, unstable months where everything felt temporary, from shelter to any sense of security. No one beat him. There were no loud tragedies for society to point at and pity. But there was also never enough time, attention, or quiet space for a child to be allowed to be vulnerable. Tracy grew up in a world where adults were always busy, surviving, and kids had to learn to understand on their own that their feelings weren't the priority. He learned very early that if he wanted peace, the best thing was to not ask for too much, not talk too much, and not let his emotions become a burden to anyone else. While other kids learned to dream, Tracy learned to observe, to listen, and to swallow everything inside, because silence was the fastest way to not bother anyone. That deprivation didn't make him rebel or seek attention through extreme actions. Instead, it created a quiet, cautious child who always stood a little further back, as if accustomed to never being called by name. In that world, basketball appeared not as a dazzling dream, but as the only refuge that didn't push him away. On the court, Tracy didn't have to explain who he was, didn't have to voice things no one asked about, because the ball always came back to him if he knew how to catch it. Basketball didn't demand he be happy or tough. It only demanded he show up. And for a child who grew up feeling forgotten, that was more than enough. Every touch of the ball was a moment Tracy felt he wasn't invisible. Every shot was a moment he was heard without opening his mouth. He didn't dream of becoming a legend, didn't think about titles or bright lights, because dreaming was a luxury reserved for kids with solid foundations. Tracy didn't grow up to dream. He grew up to endure, to adapt, to stand firm in a world that always demanded more than he could give. That's why basketball gradually became the first language he truly trusted, a language that didn't betray, didn't disappear, didn't leave him behind when everything else changed. When he ran on the court, the world became strangely simple. No more questions about feelings, no more comparisons, no more sense of being an extra child in the adults' lives. There, he didn't have to swallow sadness. It was transformed into motion, into rapid breathing, into sweat hitting the floor. But that very simplicity also quietly shaped the man Tracy McGrady would become for the rest of his life. Someone accustomed to carrying everything alone, enduring alone, getting back up without calling for anyone. When basketball became the only thing that never abandoned him, Tracy began tying his self-worth to his ability to endure, to always be ready to keep going even when no one asked if he was okay. And from there, a dangerous seed was planted very early in that young soul, that to survive, he had to be strong in silence, had to keep going even when it hurt, had to keep everything inside, because if basketball ever left, he wasn't sure what would be left of him. Tracy McGrady's childhood didn't teach him how to dream about the future. It taught him how to survive the present. And that lesson, while it helped him stand firm as a kid, would follow him his whole life, turning endurance into instinct and pain into something he learned to accept as a natural part of himself. Talent came to Tracy McGrady not like a carefully wrapped gift, but like a sentence handed down too early, before he even understood what price he'd have to pay. When Tracy started standing out on the court, the world's reaction wasn't to protect him, it was to demand more. Every step forward brought a longer, heavier list of expectations with no end in sight. People saw the height, the wingspan, the fluidity in his movement, the almost absurd natural scoring ability, and decided he had to carry everything, carry the wins, carry the hopes, carry even the failures he didn't cause. Talent forced Tracy to grow up prematurely, forced him into the role of a leader while he was still just a young man figuring himself out. No one asked if he was ready, because genius isn't allowed to hesitate. When you're labeled a natural, every effort you make becomes invisible, and every limit you have is treated like betrayal. Tracy was trained how to dribble, how to score, how to read defenses, how to stand firm under the pressure of big games, but no one taught him how to live with always being seen as a promise that had to be fulfilled. No one taught him how to face the feeling that every passing day he owed the world something bigger than the day before. Tracy's talent didn't grant him the right to be weak, because once you're tagged as gifted, any sign of fatigue is seen as a lack of desire. Any silence is interpreted as indifference. He learned very quickly that to survive, it was best to stay quiet and keep going, because explaining only disappointed people more. And so, a cruel paradox formed. Talent brought Tracy attention, but it also stripped away his right to be an ordinary person. Every time he stepped on the court, every eye waited for a performance, not for a human being with natural limits. When he succeeded, it was expected. When he slowed down even by a beat, it was a problem. There was no room for adjustment, no space for self-doubt, and certainly no space for fear. Tracy was taught how to play under the harshest conditions, but no one prepared him to live with a body treated like a machine and a soul treated as secondary. Genius didn't open an escape route. It closed every other door, leaving only one path. Keep moving forward, no matter the cost ahead. When Tracy began to realize he couldn't stop without being judged, he also began to understand that this talent would never allow him full rest. It demanded constant presence, constant perfection, constant sacrifice, even as his body and mind started protesting. To others, genius was a blessing, a ticket to glory. But in Tracy McGrady's lived experience, genius slowly revealed its dark side. A silent sentence, forcing him to carry the image of someone who could never be allowed to fall. He wasn't allowed to say he was scared, wasn't allowed to admit there were days he just wanted to disappear from the world's gaze. Because if genius weakened, the story would collapse, and no one wanted to witness that. So Tracy kept going not because he always wanted to, but because he saw no other way out. Talent had chosen him, and from that moment he was chained to a path with no turning back. That is the greatest tragedy of genius. It gives you everything others dream of, while simultaneously taking away your right to choose how you'll live with what you've been given. For Tracy McGrady, genius wasn't just superior basketball ability. It was the burden that shaped his entire life. A sentence carried out day by day, quietly, without the sound of a gavel, but heavy enough to follow him the rest of the way. When Tracy McGrady stepped into the NBA, he didn't walk onto an empty stage where the spotlight was just waiting to shine directly on him. He stepped into a scene that already had its main character, a story already written, and he was only cast in a supporting role. Next to Vince Carter, Tracy wasn't hated, wasn't looked down on, but that was exactly what made it the most bitter. He wasn't seen, not because he was inferior, but because he wasn't the story people wanted to tell. Vince was the perfect media image: wind-shredding dunks, visual explosions, a smile and personality made for posters, commercials, and highlights replayed over and over. Tracy, with his quiet demeanor, fluid and efficient movement that looked almost effortless, became something too difficult to capture in a single frame. On the same team, in the same generation, starting from the same point, Tracy gradually realized that his presence was only mentioned as a footnote, a small line on the side of a bigger story being built around someone else. The media didn't trash him, but they didn't tell his story either. They didn't dig into his inner world, didn't explore how he played, didn't ask questions about the person behind those refined moves. They just needed him to stand there as background for a brighter image. And in a world where existence is measured by how many times you're mentioned, Tracy began to become invisible even while standing in the middle of the court. Games passed. The moments he quietly contributed were quickly glossed over, because the spotlight always found somewhere else. No one asked how it felt for a young man to realize that no matter how hard he tried, the story still didn't revolve around him. No one stopped to wonder whether Tracy's silence was his nature, or the result of having grown too accustomed to never being called by name. Living next to a star wasn't just about comparing talent, it was about the right to exist in the shared narrative. Tracy didn't envy, because he understood everyone has their own path, but the prolonged indifference slowly eroded his sense of self-worth. He learned to play without demanding recognition, learned to fulfill his role, and then step back one pace, because that was what was expected. But deep inside, a quiet loneliness began to form, a wordless question. Did he really exist in the eyes of this world? The tragedy of Tracy McGrady in that period wasn't being compared, it was that he wasn't compared fairly. People didn't put him on the scale, because he wasn't the main character in the story they wanted to sell to the public. He was just the other guy, the one who showed up enough to fill the roster, enough to support, but not enough to become the center of collective memory. And the most painful part was that Tracy had no way to change it by shouting or fighting back. Because his nature wasn't to chase the spotlight, he believed the work he did would speak for itself. But in a culture where noise determines value, his silence was misinterpreted as a lack of personality, a lack of desire. The media kept telling someone else's story, and Tracy kept stepping onto the court, playing with dedication and calm, while slowly learning to accept that he was living as a living backdrop for someone else's dream. The greatest tragedy of that phase wasn't failure, it was erasure. Tracy McGrady was there, present in every game, every practice, every turning moment of the team, but he existed like a shadow, not the shadow of lesser talent, but the shadow of a story told so large, there was no room left for quieter voices. Invisible even while standing on the court, Tracy began to understand a harsh truth. In this world, sometimes not being hated hurts far more than not being seen, because it makes you fade away without anyone noticing, not even yourself. Leaving Toronto, Tracy McGrady carried with him a simple, almost naive belief. If he could just be the center, if the spotlight could finally turn toward him, everything would be okay. That belief didn't come from ambition for fame, but from a very human need to be seen, to be named, to exist fully in his own story. Toronto, with all those years standing next to an image too large, had convinced Tracy that his loneliness came from circumstance, from position, from not yet having his chance. So when he left, he didn't see it as running away, he saw it as a beginning. A new place, a new role, a new story there, he thought. He wouldn't have to stand back anymore, wouldn't have to silently accept being in the background. But some beliefs only survive until you walk through the next door. When that door closed behind him, Tracy realized he hadn't escaped the loneliness at all. He had only changed its location. In the new place, he truly was the center every gaze turned to him, every expectation placed on his shoulders. But that was exactly when the emptiness began to show more clearly. Being the center didn't mean being understood. Being the center didn't mean having someone stand beside you when things went off track. Tracy was given leadership, given responsibility, called by name in press conferences, but he was also placed in a space where failure had no one to share it with. Every loss, every silence on the court, every quiet night, all came back to him like a question with no answer. Why isn't it okay yet? The more he stood at the center, the more Tracy realized the problem had never been about whether he was seen. It was that he had nowhere to set down his burden. Loneliness followed him like a shadow, except now it no longer hid behind someone else's spotlight. It stood straight in front of him, clear and cold. Tracy began to understand that leaving Toronto didn't heal what had formed long before from a childhood that taught him to endure, from years of getting used to silence, from never being taught how to live with unnamed emotions. Being the center didn't make him less lonely. It only made the loneliness more public, heavier, because now every eye waited for him to carry it all. He told himself that if he just played better, scored more, wins would come and everything would fall into place. But basketball, even though it was his only refuge, couldn't fill the void when it was used to cover up instead of heal. Nights coming home after games, the room stayed silent, and Tracy was still alone with thoughts he couldn't speak. He began to realize a painful truth. Changing environments couldn't fix the deep cracks inside. Loneliness wasn't a product of Toronto. It was a companion that had followed him for a long time, just waiting for a space wide enough to reveal itself. And when Tracy stood at the center of the court, he also stood in the middle of an inescapable circle of expectations where every slow step was scrutinized, every silence suspected. There was no one left for him to hide behind, but also no one for him to lean on. The belief that if he could just be the center, everything would be okay, shattered quietly, not loudly or dramatically, but softly, like dreams dissolving when faced with reality. Tracy McGrady wasn't freed when he left Toronto. He simply moved from one form of invisibility to another form of loneliness, where the lights were brighter, but the darkness was deeper. And it was in that intersection that he began to understand the journey ahead wouldn't be about finding a place to stand, but about finding a way to live with the emptiness that no place could ever chase away. In Orlando, Tracy McGrady finally reached the peak that people still call every player's dream, becoming the absolute center, becoming the one carrying the entire team on his shoulders, becoming the name that made every defense tremble whenever the schedule came out. He won the scoring title, not just once, but twice, in an era when the NBA was still brutal, physical, and showed no mercy to skill-oriented players. Tracy's numbers in Orlando weren't just statistics. They were a declaration that he belonged at the very top of world basketball. But right there, in what seemed like the paradise of validation, Tracy McGrady entered the loneliest phase of his life, because the peak he stood on had no railing, no handholds, and no one standing beside him to share the weight of it. Orlando gave Tracy everything Toronto couldn't: the leadership role, the freedom, the spotlight shining straight on him. But Orlando didn't give him the most important thing: a team strong enough to go further with him. Every game followed the same cruel script. Tracy scored. Tracy exploded. Tracy dragged the team as far as he could. Then came that familiar moment when everything collapsed, because there was no one left for him to lean on. The playoff failures repeated like an inescapable loop, and each time Tracy had to hear the same question thrown at him in different ways. Was he really a leader? Was he enough to take a team deep? No one asked how much one man could carry before he broke himself. No one stopped to consider the context, the roster, or the obvious imbalance between expectations and reality. Failure was pinned directly to his name, because when you're the center, you're also the target every arrow points toward. Tracy began to feel a new kind of pressure, not loud like cheers, but heavier and more persistent. It was the pressure to prove he wasn't just a flashy scorer, not just a genius who played like it required no effort, but someone truly worthy of everything people had expected. But every time he entered the playoffs and walked out in silence, a new crack appeared in his belief. Individual success didn't bring relief. It only highlighted the emptiness around him. Tracy started questioning where his value lay when every effort seemed insufficient to change the outcome. He began doubting himself not because he didn't believe in his talent, but because he was no longer sure what that talent meant if it didn't lead to anything lasting. The nights after playoffs, when the noise of the season had died down, Tracy was left with questions no one could answer for him. How many more points could he score? What else could he do differently? And whether there was something he still wasn't enough at. That doubt didn't explode into anger or rebellion. It settled in and clung tight, quiet but persistent. Tracy didn't blame teammates, didn't air grievances publicly, because he had long been accustomed to swallowing emotions. But that very silence made him an easy target for oversimplified judgments. People started labeling him "can't win," as if failure was a personal trait rather than the result of an unbalanced collective. Tracy heard it all, read it all, but didn't push back, because pushing back required believing someone would listen, and he wasn't sure that existed. The higher he climbed, the more he felt there was no safe place to fall. No teammates strong enough to shoulder some pressure, no system solid enough to shield him, and no escape from the cycle of expectation and disappointment. Seasons passed, individual awards kept coming, but each personal trophy felt like a bitter reminder that he was winning a race whose finish line wasn't what he truly needed. Tracy McGrady began to understand a hard truth. Success didn't make him stronger, it only made him more alone. Every step higher was a step further from sharing, from the feeling of standing alongside someone against the fight. The peak in Orlando wasn't where he found himself. It was where he saw most clearly the limits of endurance. And while the world still saw him as a genius in his brightest era, Tracy began to feel a profound exhaustion, not because he wasn't good enough, but because he had been forcing himself too long in a battle where only one person stood on the front line. The first pains came to Tracy McGrady not like a clear accident that people could point to and say from here, everything changed. They came slowly, simmering, vague enough to be dismissed. A morning waking up with a stiff back, struggling to bend. A practice cut short because of a sharp twinge every time he twisted his hips. A night lying in bed, unable to find any position comfortable enough for real sleep. At first, Tracy didn't call it injury. He called it fatigue, the inevitable result of carrying an entire team through a long season. And in an environment where pain was seen as part of the job, convincing himself it was just temporary became almost a natural reflex. But the body doesn't care about reassurances. It kept sending signals, clearer and more persistent each day, as if trying to say something Tracy wasn't ready to hear. His back began reacting to movements that had once been second nature. Explosive bursts, leaps, pivots that used to happen instinctively now came with heaviness and sluggishness. Some nights, Tracy lay awake, not thinking about the game, but because the pain wouldn't let him stay still for more than a few minutes. Dark room, ticking clock, and a body that refused to obey, those were moments that never appeared on any sports broadcast. But in Tracy's world, they gradually became the new normal. The scary part wasn't the pain, it was that no one asked. No genuine "you okay?" came with it. No pause for the body to truly recover. The schedule kept rolling, expectations stayed in place, and his position didn't allow slowing down. In NBA culture, especially for stars seen as cornerstones, silence was considered strength. You endure, you play on, you speak up, you're weak. And if you're weak, someone else is always ready to step in. Tracy understood that better than anyone. He had seen players sidelined just for not returning fast enough, witnessed the coldness of a system that always moves forward without looking back. So he chose silence, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he knew the cost of admitting it. Every morning, he convinced himself that if he just warmed up harder, just pushed a little more, it would be fine. But every time he stepped on the court, his body demanded another piece of him. Stiffness became familiar. Simple movements now required more careful preparation. Tracy began to feel the stark difference between the outside image and the inside experience. Out there, he was still the genius who played like it took no effort. Inside, he was a man negotiating with his own body before every run. The most painful part wasn't the physical pain, it was not being allowed to let it exist openly. No one waited for him to recover properly, because there was no time for waiting in a league measured by results. No one asked whether playing through it was making everything worse. The only question was whether he could play, and if the answer was yes, nothing else mattered. Tracy began to understand that from this moment, his battle wasn't just on the court anymore, it was inside his own body. Every game became a test, not just of skill, but of endurance. He learned to manage pain like part of the routine, like tying his shoes or taping his ankles. Pain became something he carried, hid, and tried not to let show. But the body has its own memory. Every time it was forced past limits, it recorded, accumulated, and prepared for a bigger rebellion. Sleepless nights followed one after another, leaving Tracy to face each new day with exhaustion deeper than physical. He began to realize he was living in a dangerous loop. The more it hurt, the more he had to stay silent. The more silent he stayed, the further his body was pushed from safety. But what other choice was there for someone who had tied his self-worth to always being there, always ready, always continuing? In that world, listening to your body wasn't an encouraged option, it was a risk. And Tracy, who had been used to enduring since he was very young, once again chose the most familiar path. He didn't ask for rest, didn't complain, didn't make a big deal. He kept playing, kept smiling for the cameras, kept up the image of someone nothing could slow down. But deep inside, a truth was slowly taking shape. His body was crying for help, and the world around him had no time to listen. Injury was no longer an incident. It was the beginning of the real tragedy. A tragedy without a bang, without a clear moment to mark it. Only the daily, nightly erosion in silence. And from that moment, Tracy McGrady stepped into the most dangerous phase of his life. The phase where he had to live with pain as part of his identity, In an environment where silence wasn't just a choice, it was the condition for continuing to exist. From the moment his body started crying for help, Tracy McGrady stepped into the cruelest phase of his life, not because he played worse, but because he had to live two parallel lives without ever being allowed to acknowledge the existence of the second one. Every game from then on was no longer just a professional challenge. It became a silent negotiation between will and flesh, where he paid the price for every minute he spent on the court. Painkillers became part of the routine, taken not to heal, but to be able to step back into the lights. Tape wrapped tightly around his back, around his knees, around joints that had started to betray him, not to cure, but to hold everything together for one more night. Before tip-off, Tracy sat quietly in the locker room, eyes down on the floor, breathing slow, as if mentally preparing to enter a place no one else could see. When the door opened and he stepped onto the court, the world only saw the familiar smile, the calm demeanor, the fluid moves that made everything look like there had never been a problem. The cameras captured those moments and told an easy-to-believe story. The genius was still there, still cool, still efficient, still effortless. But the real story of Tracy McGrady began the moment the final buzzer sounded and the lights began to dim. There were nights he couldn't stand straight when he got home, having to lean against the wall to take slow steps. There were mornings he couldn't bend down to put on his shoes because even a small movement sent pain radiating through his back like punishment. His body became a battlefield where every game left its mark, and those marks were never allowed to show publicly. Tracy learned to smile for the cameras, answer interviews in a steady voice, talk about strategy, about teammates, about safe things, while inside he was counting every breath to keep the pain from spiraling out of control. No one saw the moments he lay still in the dark, waiting for the medication to kick in, waiting for the pain to ease enough to get a few hours of sleep. No one recorded the times he woke up in the middle of the night, cold sweat, back locked up, wondering if tomorrow he'd still be able to step onto the court. But the next morning, he still showed up on time, tape neatly wrapped, face showing nothing out of the ordinary. In the NBA world, that was the image of professionalism. In Tracy's life, it was silent sacrifice. The media, unable to see that second life, started telling a different story. They said he lacked fire. They said he wasn't intense enough, didn't scream, didn't pound his chest like the leaders they were used to. They compared him to other players who showed more visible emotion and concluded that Tracy McGrady didn't have the killer instinct. Those comments weren't just wrong, they were cruel, because they judged a man based on what he couldn't do when his body had already been worn down. The truth was that every time Tracy stepped onto the court in this phase, he was playing in physical hell, where every leap had to be calculated, every twist carried the risk of pain exploding. He didn't scream not because he didn't want to fight, but because he was channeling all his energy into keeping his body from collapsing. He didn't show emotion the way others expected, because he had used up all his emotion just to endure. And so, the two lives continued side by side. One, Tracy McGrady, on the court, seen, analyzed, judged, and one Tracy McGrady off the court, quiet, exhausted, carrying pains no one ever asked about. Every game took a little more from him, not just physically, but in the belief that he could keep going like this much longer. But he kept going, because stopping meant admitting something he wasn't ready to say. In the league's culture, admitting pain opened the door to being replaced, to being pushed aside. Tracy had seen it happen to others, and he knew he couldn't let it happen to him, not for fame, but because basketball had become the only identity he knew how to hold on to. There were times he wondered if the world would see him differently if they knew the truth. But that question was quickly buried, because the schedule didn't wait, and the pain didn't care about philosophical thoughts. Every day that passed was another lesson in balancing keeping up appearances and keeping his body together, meeting expectations without completely breaking. The game became cruel in a new way. It was no longer a contest between two teams, but a private war between Tracy and his own limits. There were nights he sat alone for a long time, staring at the worn tape, at the indentations on his skin, realizing that not a single moment in all that time had been free. Every point, every assist, every round of applause was paid for with hours of unseen pain. But he still stepped onto the court, still played, still stayed silent, because that was the only way he knew to survive in a world that had tied his worth to always being ready. The media kept talking about lack of fire, about indifference, and Tracy kept smiling for the cameras, as if the words didn't touch him. But inside, they accumulated, blending with the physical pain to create a deeper, harder-to-name exhaustion. This was the most painful chapter of Tracy McGrady's life, not because it had a clear moment of collapse, but because it dragged on, repeated, and offered no clean escape. Every game took something from him, and no game ever gave anything back. But he kept going, because for Tracy, stopping had never been an easy choice. And in that continuation, he quietly accepted a harsh truth, that sometimes, to maintain the image of an effortless genius, you have to sacrifice yourself in silence, play with a smile on your face, while your entire body screams in the dark. When Tracy McGrady arrived in Houston, hope didn't come like a cheer. It came like a slow exhale, after years of holding his breath. For the first time in his career, he looked around and saw a real cornerstone standing beside him, not as background, not to share the spotlight, but to carry the same weight together. Yao Ming wasn't like any teammate Tracy had ever had before. Yao was tall, calm, quiet, carrying an entire nation on his shoulders, but there was a steadiness in him that made Tracy believe things could be different this time. No need for many words, just standing next to each other in the locker room, two men carrying different pains understood they were looking in the same direction. For the first time, Tracy allowed himself to think of a championship as a real possibility, not a distant luxury dream. Houston gave him a better system, an organization that believed winning was a shared goal rather than a burden placed on one individual. In those rare moments, Tracy felt the weight on his back lighten just a little, not because the pain disappeared, but because finally someone was sharing it. He started to believe that all the years of endurance before could lead to a deserving ending, that his body, though worn down, could still push a little further if the destination was clear enough. But hope, when it arrives too late, carries its own kind of cruelty. While Tracy was learning to believe again, his body had already begun cracking in places that couldn't be reversed. And beside him, Yao was also fighting his own limits. A giant body not built to withstand the NBA's brutal intensity over many seasons. The two men met at a point when both already carried too many scars. Whenever one got healthy, the other slowed down, as if hope was always offbeat. The seasons in Houston passed with a bittersweet sense of being halfway there. When Tracy could explode, Yao had to sit out. When Yao returned and created the balance Tracy had waited years for, Tracy's body protested even more fiercely. Hope appeared and vanished. Never long enough to become reality, but clear enough to make the regret deeper. Tracy began to realize this new belief wasn't salvation. It was a painful reminder that his time wasn't as abundant as he wanted to believe. Every game alongside Yao carried both exhilaration and fear, because he knew any moment could be the last time they stood together at their best. There were nights Tracy watched Yao rehab, through injury after injury, and saw his own reflection in it, two bodies forced to keep going for dreams that hadn't yet taken shape. And in that empathy, Tracy understood this hope wasn't a beginning. It was the final stretch of a long journey. He still played, still fought, still exploded in moments that made fans believe everything was still there. But inside, he knew he was leaning on fragments. Houston didn't fail because of lack of talent or effort. They failed because the bodies of their two pillars couldn't withstand the same dream at the same time. Tracy didn't blame Yao, didn't blame fate, because he was used to accepting, but every time hope faded, something inside him quietly closed off. He began to understand that some stories, no matter how beautiful, can't have a complete ending simply because they come too late. The hope in Houston was real, deep, and sincere, but it arrived when Tracy McGrady had already started breaking from the inside, when his body no longer had the strength to endure one more weight. And that's why every memory of Houston afterward carried two opposing colors: gratitude for being believed in for the first time, and pain for realizing that belief hadn't come soon enough to save everything. That night, the world witnessed a miracle. Tracy McGrady only remembered the pain. Those final 33 seconds were replayed thousands of times on television, edited into highlights, described with the most flowery language modern basketball could offer for an individual moment. 13 points in 33 seconds, a step-back three-pointer, a steal, another shot, the crowd roaring, the clock ticking down, the opponents stunned. It was the moment that made the whole world believe Tracy McGrady was the embodiment of the impossible. But when the final buzzer sounded and the arena exploded, Tracy wasn't thinking about history, wasn't thinking about legacy, wasn't thinking about having done something very few had ever done. In his mind at that moment, there was only one simple, very human thought: how to breathe. His lungs felt crushed, his calves locked up from cramps, his back stabbing with pain, so that every stride he'd just taken felt like another cut into an already fractured body. He bent over, hands on his knees, trying to draw deep breaths while the cheers still rolled like waves. No one saw it, because the cameras were only searching for the victorious face, not the exhaustion. In the fans' memory, it was the night Tracy McGrady defeated time. In Tracy's memory, it was the night his body almost couldn't take one more beat. Every shot he released in those 33 seconds didn't come from ease. It came from near desperate effort, where he pushed his body past a safety threshold he knew he shouldn't cross. Cramps gripped his calves, his back tensed with every twist, his breathing so ragged that everything in front of him blurred for a split second. But he kept shooting, because in that moment, his only choice was to continue or collapse in front of tens of thousands of eyes. And Tracy McGrady, who had lived his whole life with the instinct to endure, chose to continue once again. When the game ended, teammates hugged him, fans chanted his name, commentators called it one of the greatest moments in NBA history. But the moment he stepped into the backstage area, when the noise was shut out behind the door, Tracy had to brace himself against the wall to walk. His legs trembled uncontrollably, his back locked up, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he'd just traded away more than anyone realized. That night, the world celebrated a miracle. Tracy lay in bed, cold sweat, body aching like he'd been in a car wreck, unable to sleep because the pain wouldn't allow it. But the next morning, all that remained in the collective memory was the number: 13 points, 33 seconds. No one mentioned the cramps. No one mentioned that he could barely breathe. No one asked what the price of that moment was. And that's where the irony began. The greatest moment of Tracy McGrady's career also became the longest cage he was ever locked in. The media started using that night as a measuring stick for everything he did afterward. Every time he didn't explode, people asked, why not like those 33 seconds? Every time he slowed down, they replayed the highlight, as if it proved he could do so much more, he just didn't want to. No one asked whether his body could repeat that without collapsing. No one remembered that the moment wasn't normal. It was the final explosion of a body already pushed to the edge. Tracy heard those comparisons in silence. He understood that he had created an image the world would never let go of. An extraordinary moment easily makes people forget the very human rest of the life behind it. To the fans, those 33 seconds proved Tracy McGrady could do anything. To Tracy, those 33 seconds were a warning that his body couldn't handle many more like it. But there was no room for caution in the way the story was told. That night was detached from context, from the pain, from the string of sleepless days, and placed on the altar of wonder. From then on, every time Tracy failed to meet expectations, people turned back to that clip like a silent accusation. He began to feel that he had unintentionally created an unrepeatable standard that even he no longer had the strength to live up to. The greatest moment didn't free him. It chained him to an image his body could no longer sustain. And so, what should have been pure pride became a media curse. The world remembered the miracle. Tracy remembered the pain. The world believed that was his true essence. Tracy knew it was only a moment paid for with a price no one else had to bear. In that contrast, he kept walking, carrying a memory that every time it was brought up reminded him that sometimes the greatest moment can also be the thing that causes the most misunderstanding in your entire life. When Tracy McGrady began to clearly feel his body saying no, he no longer panicked. It wasn't an explosive moment or a sudden injury that dropped him in the middle of the court. It came slower, more cruelly, like a truth seeping in day by day. Every morning, waking up, he needed a few extra minutes just to sit up from bed, his back stiff, knees throbbing quietly, and some days even bending down to tie his shoes was enough to make him pause and breathe. Tracy understood it in a very calm way. This body had given almost everything it had. And he also began to understand that he wouldn't get the glorious ending the world usually demands from geniuses. No farewell shot, no teammates lifting him up, no trophy placed in his hands as final recognition, just the quiet truth that he was racing against time, and time was winning. The most painful part wasn't the fear of being forgotten, it was the clarity of awareness. Tracy wasn't angry. He didn't blame coaches, teammates, fate, or the NBA itself. He was just sad, a mature sadness from someone who had lived long enough in pain to no longer have the energy to fight back. He looked back on his years and understood that this body had been used like a tool, a means to sustain other people's expectations, rarely treated like a living thing that needed to be listened to. He once believed that if he just endured a little more, everything would be okay. But now, every stride reminded him that a little more might be too much. In the locker room, Tracy started sitting longer after every game, not to reflect on strategy, but to give his body time for the pain to subside. There were nights he sat alone, hand rubbing his back, staring at the floor, listening to the noise outside gradually fade. He knew he was no longer the person who could wake up tomorrow feeling light. That feeling had left long ago. In its place was a deep exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had tried too long without a break. And in that exhaustion, he accepted. Not acceptance of failure, but acceptance of the reality that the body has limits, and he had gone very close to, even beyond, them. Conversations with doctors no longer revolved around, "When will you return to your peak?" but how to maintain. Tracy listened in silence, because he understood that every maintain was just another word for trade-off. He knew if he continued, the price wouldn't just be his career. It would be the ability to live a normal life afterward. There were days he wondered if he should have stopped earlier, but then realized the question led nowhere. He had lived the only way he knew, endure and continue. And now, when the body said enough, he no longer argued. That awareness didn't come with tears or grand tragedy. It arrived like a quiet evening, when he sat alone and understood that the final chapter wouldn't look like the fairy tales told about legends. Tracy watched younger, healthier players run with the energy he once had, and in his heart there was no envy, only a gentle sadness. Not sadness for them, but sadness for himself, no longer being there. He understood that his body had sacrificed too much to trade for moments the world honored, and now that price was being collected day by day. When he thought about the future, Tracy didn't see bright pictures. He saw a quieter path, where he would have to learn to live with new limits. And that, in some way, was even harder than facing failure on the court, because his whole life had been defined by movement, by being superior to others. Now he had to learn to slow down, to accept that not everything could be won by will. Some battles, even if you don't lose, you don't win either. You just stop, because there's nothing left to give from yourself. Tracy didn't resent. He looked back on his career with rare honesty. He knew he had given everything, and perhaps that was the only thing he could be proud of without needing anyone's confirmation. No championship ring could soothe the present pain, but no one could say he had held anything back for himself. His body was the clearest proof of that dedication. And, when he accepted that his ending wouldn't be written in glory, but in silence, he also accepted a very fragile kind of peace. It was the peace of someone who understood he wasn't defeated by opponents, but by time and human limits. Tracy knew he was running out, not of talent, but of the strength to keep forcing himself against expectations. And in that awareness, he let go a little, not to quit, but to acknowledge that some endings don't need to be glorious to be meaningful. Sometimes, realizing you won't have a perfect ending is the first step toward finally getting to rest. After his body had said enough in full, Tracy McGrady didn't choose the path many other stars take when facing the end. No carefully planned farewell tour, no long speeches to explain, no apologies to the world for not becoming what they expected. Tracy didn't turn his exit into an event. He didn't need a stage for the final moment, because his whole life he had stood too long under the lights. His career didn't end with a bang. It ended with a breath that grew weaker, slower, almost unnoticed. Appearances grew rarer. Minutes on the court dwindled. Practices became more burden than joy. And then, while the world was still busy chasing dramatic stories, Tracy McGrady quietly stepped away from the center of everything. No one could point to a specific moment and say this was when he disappeared, because he never really announced it. He simply was no longer there in the way people had grown used to. No drama, because Tracy was never someone who lived off the noise. No blame, because he understood that finding someone to vent anger at wouldn't heal his body or give back the years that had passed. He didn't stand in front of the media to talk about his pain, didn't build a tragic story to seek sympathy. Instead, he chose silence, a very Tracy McGrady kind of silence, just like the way he had lived most of his career. There were days his name appeared on the roster, but it no longer sparked excitement. There were games where he stepped in and stepped out, leaving the feeling that this wasn't his place anymore. His career faded like a flame running out of oxygen, not because someone snuffed it out, but because it had burned too long. To many people, it was a bland ending, but for Tracy, it was the only choice left to hold on to the human part of himself. He understood that if he kept clinging to the old image, he would have to sacrifice even more, not just physically, but his ability to live a normal life afterward. And he didn't want that. Not because he stopped loving basketball, but because he had loved it long enough to know when it was time to let go. Disappearing wasn't an act of running away, it was an act of preservation. Tracy didn't need to prove anything more. What he had given was clear enough in every ache, every slow step, every season he forced himself past limits. There was a very particular sadness in the way he left, because it didn't allow fans a complete closing moment. No final standing ovation in the middle of the court. No highlight reel to recap everything he had done. Everything just quietly drifted away, as if the world accepted that Tracy McGrady had gradually become part of the past without needing an official goodbye. And perhaps that very absence of ceremony reflected his life most accurately. A man who gave in silence and also withdrew in silence. In the final days of his career, Tracy clearly saw the change in other people's eyes. No longer the heavy expectations, but a quiet kind of pity. The thing he hated more than the criticisms from before. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruined genius or a star who never reached his potential. He wanted to be remembered as a man who walked his entire path, even if that path didn't have a glorious finish. And to do that, he had to disappear before his image could be distorted by unfair comparisons. Tracy McGrady's career closed not with an announced decision, but with a truth gradually accepted. He was no longer at the center of discussions. His name no longer appeared in predictions or expectations. But in that quietness, there was a rare dignity. He didn't cling to what had passed, didn't try to recreate the miracle of those 33 seconds or the peak scoring seasons. He let everything rest properly, like someone who understood that the harder you try to hold on, the more easily things break. No apologies, because he didn't believe he owed anyone an explanation. No farewell tour, because he didn't want to turn his exhaustion into a performance. Just a slow, respectful withdrawal, respectful to himself and to the game that had taken so much. And as Tracy McGrady's career faded like a weakening breath, what remained wasn't the noise of an ending, but a deep silence where people could only recognize his value once he was no longer there. When the arena lights had receded far away and his career no longer demanded he keep proving anything, Tracy McGrady found the one place he had never failed: his home. There were no stat sheets, no comparisons, no questions about potential or legacy, just ordinary evenings where he walked through the door and didn't have to carry the image of a genius. For the first time in many years, Tracy was allowed to simply be a man coming home, with all the unspoken exhaustion. Family became the final lifeline, not because they shielded him from the past, but because they didn't demand he live as if that past had never existed. At home, he didn't have to brace himself. No one expected him to score. No one waited for him to create extraordinary moments. Just his presence was enough. As a husband, Tracy learned a different kind of responsibility, quiet and enduring, more than anything he had experienced on the court. No cheers when he fulfilled his role, no applause for the invisible efforts, but that very absence of reward brought him a sense of realness he had lost long ago. In short conversations after dinner, in quiet moments sitting together in front of the TV, Tracy realized his value wasn't tied to what he could do for the outside world. Here, he was seen through the way he listened, the way he showed up, the way he shared the very small things he never had space to think about before. Family didn't ask him about past games. They asked if he was tired, if he was in pain, if he needed rest. Those seemingly simple questions became a luxury he had never had throughout his playing years. As a father, Tracy stepped into a role that both frightened and filled him with gratitude. Frightened because he wasn't sure he was whole enough to be the solid support he wanted to be. Grateful because, for the first time, he was loved without having to perform anything extraordinary. His kids didn't see him as a legend or an icon. They saw him as a dad who showed up on time, who sat on the floor to play, who told stories without needing climaxes. In his children's eyes, Tracy wasn't measured by what he had accomplished, but by how he was there when they needed him. And in that simplicity, he found a fullness no title had ever brought. At home, he wasn't the guy who should have had a different ending. He was just a man living in rhythm with his family. Those ordinary evenings gradually became the most precious thing. No more packed schedules, no more endless flights, no more days forcing himself in front of cameras. Tracy learned to slow down, even though his body sometimes still reminded him of the past years with lingering aches. But unlike before, now he didn't have to hide those pains. He could sit down, he could rest, he could admit he needed a quiet day. Family didn't see that as weakness. They saw it as natural, and that acceptance helped Tracy face himself for the first time without judgment. There was a gentle paradox in Tracy McGrady's life. The place where he was valued most was where he always felt lacking, and the place where he didn't have to be great was where he found his true worth. At home, he didn't need to win. He didn't need to outdo anyone. He didn't need to prove he deserved to exist. He just needed to live. And for someone who had spent his whole life enduring and continuing, that was a rare kind of freedom. Family didn't fully heal the wounds he carried, but they gave him a space where those wounds didn't define who he was. In those quiet moments, Tracy began to understand that the biggest failure wasn't not getting a glorious ending. It was forgetting that he could still be full somewhere else. Family didn't erase his sadness, but they put it in its proper place. A part of life, not the whole thing. And in that one place where no one demanded he be great, Tracy McGrady could finally breathe slower, live slower, and realize that no matter how the world saw him, he was still enough in the simplest roles of a human being. When Tracy McGrady's name was called at the Hall of Fame, it was the moment that, in theory, every story should close, with long applause and a full smile. The final recognition arrived, like confirmation that the years he lived, endured, and gave weren't meaningless. But for Tracy, that honor didn't bring the relief outsiders might imagine. It came late, not in the sense of historical time, but in the sense of body and soul, when the pains had become permanent memories, when the what-if questions had sunk so deep they no longer needed to be asked to exist. On the podium, Tracy stood tall, voice calm, words measured, as if he were telling someone else's story. A smile appeared, but didn't linger long, because in that moment, he understood very clearly. This title couldn't give back the sleepless nights, couldn't erase the mornings when his body was stiff, couldn't fix the seasons that ended in silence. The Hall of Fame recognized the career, but it didn't touch the part of life that had been worn down to create that career. Recognition that comes late always carries two sides. One is consolation that finally the world sees you. The other is sadness that when the world sees you, you are no longer whole enough to fully receive the joy. Tracy knew he deserved it, but he also knew that feeling deserving no longer meant feeling healed. The years of pain didn't vanish just because a plaque bore his name. The what-ifs. What if the body had been more durable? What if hope had come sooner? What if there had been one more season without forcing himself, still quietly existed, without needing to be mentioned? They no longer tormented him, but they didn't leave either. They stood there, like invisible markers of a road he had walked with everything he had. In the moment of being honored, Tracy didn't see numbers, awards, or highlights. He saw empty locker rooms, red-eye flights, worn-out tape, practices where his body protested while the schedule didn't wait. He remembered the times he was called lacking fire, when his silence was mistaken for indifference. The Hall of Fame didn't erase those misunderstandings, it only placed them in a more formal frame, where people acknowledged that despite the misunderstandings, he was still an irreplaceable part of history. But acknowledgement isn't the same as release. Tracy didn't come to this moment for compensation. He came because it was the logical stopping point of a long journey, not because he believed it would make everything lighter. There is a cold honesty in the way Tracy stood before this honor. He didn't embellish the past, didn't tell the story as a series of stolen victories, and didn't build a tragedy to beg for compassion. He said just enough, the way he had always lived. And in that just enough, people could hear something very clear: acceptance without full joy. Tracy accepted that his life didn't have a fairy tale ending, and the Hall of Fame wasn't the final page rewriting the story to the audience's liking. It was only a necessary period right where it belonged, but it couldn't erase the painful commas that came before. Tracy's smile wasn't complete, not because he wasn't grateful, but because he didn't forget. He didn't forget the price he paid, didn't forget the times he had to choose silence to keep going, didn't forget the feeling of hope arriving when his body had already started to break. This honor confirmed what he had known for a long time, that he belonged here. But it also reminded him that belonging doesn't mean being compensated. And perhaps Tracy McGrady's greatest maturity was understanding that not every recognition has the duty to heal. Some only have the duty to remember. When the ceremony ended, The applause faded. Tracy walked out with the same familiar calm stride. He carried neither a sense of victory nor bitterness, only a quiet sadness mixed with composure. Composure because the story had finally been named correctly, sadness because that name couldn't turn back time. The Hall of Fame stands there as a monument to history. Tracy, with everything he had lived, understood that honors can come late, and when they do, they don't necessarily make everything easier. Sometimes they only make the truth clearer, that the years of pain were still years of pain, and the what-if questions still exist, even when your name has been etched in the highest place. When all the lights had finally gone out, when the stat sheets had become archived data, and when the name Tracy McGrady was no longer called every night on broadcasts, what remained wasn't a fierce sense of loss, but a very deep silence. It wasn't the silence of failure, nor the silence of loud regret. It was the silence of a man who had finally walked to the very end of his road and understood he had nothing left to prove. Tracy didn't lose his way. He was never lost. What he lost was his body little by little, season by season, sleepless night by sleepless night, in a journey with no miracle waiting at the end. No championship ring to place on the table as justification. No final shot to close every question. Just one stark truth. He had paid enough for the genius he carried from when he was very young. Tracy McGrady's life wasn't short on glory, but that glory never came free. Every moment that left others in awe was traded for a piece of strength that never came back. Every time he stepped onto the court with that calm demeanor was a negotiation with pain, with exhaustion, with the fear that this body might betray him at any moment. And he never spoke it out, not out of pride, but because he was raised in a world where silence was the condition for survival. Tracy didn't ask for pity, didn't construct a victim narrative, didn't blame anyone. He carried everything on his own shoulders, because from very early on, he learned to endure instead of cry for help. That's why the price he paid wasn't just in physical pain, it was in rarely allowing himself to be vulnerable in front of others. When looking back on that entire journey, it's easy for people to talk about what he lacked: a championship, a complete ending, a beautiful enough legacy by media standards. But what Tracy McGrady had is much harder to name. He had a character that wasn't bent by pressure. He had a rare honesty with himself, even when it led to misunderstanding. He had a quiet dignity of someone who knew he had given everything and had no reason left to argue with the past. Tracy didn't need to prove he should have had more, because if you looked at his body, at the years he lived with pain, people would understand he had paid with something more expensive than any title. No miracle appeared to reverse fate. No complete healing moment where every wound was erased and every question answered. The pains are still there, the limits still exist, and memories of the years he forced himself still return on quiet evenings. But instead of fighting them, Tracy learned to live with them. He didn't see it as punishment, but as the natural consequence of a life lived to the fullest. Some leave the court with intact bodies, but empty souls. Tracy left with a tired body, but a very clear mindset. He knew who he was, and he didn't need anyone else to redefine it. In the silence of the present, Tracy McGrady is no longer surrounded by what-if questions in a tormenting way. They exist, but they no longer dominate him. He understood that every path has its own price, and his path was one of prolonged endurance, of keeping going even without guarantees ahead. That doesn't make him more tragic, it makes him very human. A man who chose honesty with his abilities and limits, instead of trying to become a legend by someone else's mold. Tracy's ending wasn't a roaring victory, nor a failure to be pitied. It was a quiet completion. He didn't lose direction, because he always knew where he was going, forward, day by day, with everything he had left. And when there was nothing left to take from his body, he stopped without regret. Not because he didn't love basketball, but because he had loved it long enough to know that some loves must end to preserve self-respect. At that final point, Tracy McGrady stood neither as a winner nor as a loser, but as a man who lived fully within human limits. No championship ring to show off, no miracle to recount, no complete healing to soothe memory, only character, honesty, and a man who had endured enough, given enough, and no longer owed the world anything. And perhaps that is the quietest but most enduring legacy he left. Because in a world of numbers and titles, there is still another way to be remembered, not for what you won, but for what you survived without ever asking for pity. Some men are not remembered for what they won. They are remembered for what they survived without ever asking for pity. The story of Tracy McGrady doesn't just make people sad because of a career left unfinished by championship standards. It also stirs deep sorrow because of the quiet price one man paid to preserve his character intact. Throughout the story, Tracy emerges not as a pitiful victim, but as a classic American man of an older generation, enduring, silent, and continuing, even when no one asked if he could still bear it. From the years in Orlando, when he became the scoring king but had to carry a team with no way out, to the Houston phase, where championship hope first appeared alongside Yao Ming, but arrived when both bodies had already started breaking, the story reveals a painful truth. Success doesn't always save you. Sometimes it only makes the loneliness clearer. The peak is that moment of 13 points in 33 seconds, the moment the media called a miracle. But in Tracy's memory was a chain of pain, cramps, and the feeling of not being able to breathe. That detail exposes the cruelty of how society honors. People remember the light, but forget the price in the dark. When Tracy left the NBA without goodbye, without drama, without blame, his career faded like a weakening breath that reflected a very American but deeply human choice: to withdraw, to preserve dignity instead of clinging to old glory. The lesson this story leaves for Americans isn't about basketball, it's about life. Don't measure a person's worth only by results, titles, or explosive moments. Learn to see what they endured in silence. Tracy McGrady reminds us that real strength isn't always loud, and some people don't need a final victory to be respected because they lived fully, honestly, and endured enough for the path they chose. If Tracy McGrady's story has touched you and made you see the price of talent differently, please hit subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on these journeys of real life filled with silence and sacrifice like this one. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring great stories not measured by wins, but by human endurance.